Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are starting a new book, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. But first, reading updates. I am reading my first ever Stephen King book. I'm reading The Eyes of the Dragon, and I'm reading this because another book by Stephen King, Holly, won for Best Horror for 2023, and I was intimidated because it's Stephen King. That's why. And I haven't read anything by him, so it was just a little intimidating. So this was recommended, and I am enjoying it so far. I'm on page 148 out of 372, and it's pretty good. So the story so far is it's about this royal family, a king and two sons, and this like magician who is also the first or one of the advisors to the king. And the mother slash wife slash queen dies in childbirth of the second son. And the second son, like, there's a lot of strife with him. Like, he blames himself for a lot of things. He knows that there's whispers, everything like that. He knows that he's not the favorite and that he's just going to be the forever prince. And this uh advisor slash magician is sowing in discord and trying to make it so that the second son becomes the king, because then he will be able to have more control and more sway in how things are being ruled. And it's interesting so far. So he's been trying to figure out, one, how to get rid of the king and make it not look like he's the one that did it, but also how to get rid of the first son. So that's where I'm at so far, and I'm enjoying it. And the storytelling is really nice. It is told from the perspective of someone who has like lived through all of this and is retelling it to us. And there's a couple moments where like we'll get to something, and then he'll be like, or the narrator will be like, but that's for another time, or it'll be like, like this is a secret passageway that they found and this is how they found it. And then they'll go back and be like a year before or whatever it is, and then like talk about the discovery of that secret passage. So I am enjoying it so far, and it is like an easy, quick read. So that's nice. That's nice. So reading that, and I think those are the only updates. Yeah, I think so. I think everything else I talked about last time. So, Wuthering Heights. Here we go. Apparently I have read this book. I own this book. When we picked it, it was like, I think I own this book. I walked over to my shelf. I do in fact own it. And it's like, did I ever read this book? I did in fact read it. I read it in 2014, and I remember absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing about it. So it'll basically be a first time read for me. So that's cool. Oh, there's an introduction in this one. So the copy that I have, or the edition that I have, is the Barnes and Noble's Barnes and Noble Classic Edition. Um, so that's kind of nice. Oh, and there's like information about Emily Bronte first. So that's cool. Okay, well, we're not going to read her timeline. And I feel like introductions a lot of the times have spoilers in them, because yeah, they're giving context to things, but they're also like, and then this person died and what it means is this, and we don't want that. So I think we're going to skip the introduction. So we'll skip the introduction. I've decided. I've decided this. Okay, and then the editor's preface also gives spoilers, so we're not going to do that. We're just going to hop into the actual book. But I do have some like very short snippets of like context things from the magical world of Wikipedia. So I'll read that without going into like all of the extra things that the book has. So, Okay, so Wuthering Heights. is the first and only novel by the English author Emily Bronte, initially published in 1847 under her pen name Ellis Bell. It concerns two families of the landed gentry living on the West Yorkshire moors, the Earnshaws and the Lintons, and their turbulent relationships with the Earnshaws' foster son, Heathcliff. The novel was influenced by Romanticism and Gothic fiction. Wuthering Heights is now widely considered to be one of the greatest novels ever written in English, but contemporaneous reviews were polarized. It was controversial for its depictions of mental and physical cruelty, including domestic abuse, and for its challenges to Victorian morality, religion, and the class system. We're getting into it. So yes, there are content warnings, which I have placed, so proceed at your own risk. And then I guess, okay, so the inside flap, I'm gonna take this cover off because covers on hardcovers just get in the way most of the times. So it says, Wuthering Heights. Emily Bronte's only novel remains one of literature's most disturbing explorations into the dark side of romantic passion. An unpolished and devastating epic of childhood playmates who grow into soulmates, Wuthering Heights revolves around the willfully childish Catherine and the dark Heathcliff, who, in the words of Charlotte Bronte, exemplifies the effects which a life of continued injustice and hard usage may produce on a naturally perverse, vindictive, and inexorable disposition. Heathcliff and Cathy believe they're destined to love each other forever, but when cruelty and snobbery separate them, their untamed emotions literally consume them. Set amid the wild and stormy Yorkshire moors, Wuthering Heights is widely regarded as the most original tale of thwarted desire and heartbreak in the English language. There you go. Oh, and there's one more note that I wanted to say as well. There it is. Wuthering Heights was accepted by publisher Thomas Newby, along with Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, before the success of their sister Charlotte Bronte's novel, Jane Eyre. But they were published later. After Emily's death, Charlotte edited a second edition of Wuthering Heights, which was published in 1850, which is this one. It has inspired an array of adaptations across several media, including English singer-songwriter Kate Bush's song of the same name. So, with all of that fun context, let's throw this cover to the side and let's do it. Wuthering Heights, Chapter 1. Oh, and there are footnotes in here. We'll see how annoying they get, but let's do it. Okay. 1801. I have just returned from a visit to my landlord, the solitary neighbor that I shall be troubled with. This is certainly a beautiful country. In all England, I do not believe that I could have fixed on a situation so completely removed from the stir of society. A perfect misanthropist's heaven, and Mr. Heathcliff and I are such a suitable pair to divide the desolation between us. A capital fellow. He little imagined how my heart warmed towards him when I beheld his black eyes withdraw so suspiciously under their brows as I rode up, and when his fingers sheltered themselves with a jealous resolution still further in his waistcoat as I announced my name. Mr. Heathcliff? I said. A nod was the answer. Mr. Lockwood, your new tenant, sir. I do believe myself the honor of calling as soon as possible after my arrival to express the hope that I have not inconvenienced you by my perseverance in soliciting the occupation of Thrushcross Grange. I heard yesterday you had had some thoughts. Thrushcross Grange is my own, sir, he interrupted, wincing. I should not allow anyone to inconvenience me if I could hinder it. Walk in. The walk in was uttered with closed teeth and expressed the sentiment, go to the deuce. Even the gate over which he leant manifested no sympathizing movement to the words, and I think that circumstance determined me to accept the invitation. I felt interested in a man who seemed more exaggeratedly reserved than myself. When he saw my horse's breast fairly pushing the barrier, he did put out his hand to unchain it, and then sullenly preceded me up the causeway, calling as we entered the court, "Joseph, take Mr. Lockwood's horse, and bring up some wine." Here we have the whole establishment of domestics, I suppose, was the reflection suggested by this compound order. No wonder the grass grows up between the flags and cattle are the only hedge cutters. Joseph was an elderly, nay, an old man, very old, perhaps, though hale and sinewy. "The Lord help us," he soliloquized in an undertone of peevish displeasure, while relieving me of my horse, looking, meantime, in my face so sourly that I charitably conjectured he must have need of divine aid to digest his dinner, and his pious ejaculation had no reference to my unexpected advent. Wuthering Heights is the name of Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling. Wuthering being a significant provincial adjective, descriptive of the atmospheric tumult to which its station is exposed in stormy weather. Pure, bracing ventilation they must have up there at all times, indeed. One may guess the power of the north wind blowing over the edge by the excessive slant of a few stunted firs at the end of the house, and by a range of gaunt thorns all stretching their limbs one way, as if craving alms of the sun. Happily the architect had foresight to build it strong. The narrow windows are deeply set in the wall, and the corners defended with large jutting stone. Before passing the threshold, I paused to admire a quantity of grotesque carving lavished over the front, and especially about the principal door, above which, among a wilderness of crumbling griffins and shameless little boys, I detected the date 1500 and the name Catherine Earnshaw. I would have made a few comments and requested a short history of the place from the surly owner, but his attitude at the door appeared to demand my speedy entrance or complete departure, and I had no desire to aggravate his impatience previous to inspecting the penetralium. And there's a note right after penetralium that says innermost area or inner sanctum. One step brought us into the family sitting room, without any introductory lobby or passage. They call it here the house, preeminently. It includes kitchen and parlor generally, but I believe at Wuthering Heights the kitchen is forced to retreat altogether into another quarter. At least I distinguished a chatter of tongues and a clatter of culinary utensils deep within, and I observed no signs of roasting, boiling, or baking about the huge fireplace, nor any glitter of copper saucepans and tin colanders on the walls. Colanders, there is a note here. It says colanders or strainers, so I didn't know that needed a note. But maybe it does. One end, indeed, reflected splendidly both light and heat from ranks of immense pewter dishes, interspersed with silver jugs and tankards, towering row after row on a vast oak dresser to the very roof. The latter had never been underdrawn. Its entire anatomy lay bare to an inquiring eye, except where a frame of wood laden with oatcakes and clusters of legs of beef, mutton, and ham concealed it. And there is a note after the latter had never been underdrawn, and it says covered with lath and plaster. Above the chimney were sundry villainous old guns and a couple of horse pistols, and, by way of ornament, 3 gaudily painted canisters disposed along its ledge. The floor was of smooth white stone, the chairs high-backed, primitive structures, painted green, one or two heavy black ones lurking in the shade. In an arch under the dresser reposed a huge, liver-colored bitch pointer, surrounded by a swarm of squealing puppies and other dogs haunted other recesses. The apartment and furniture would have been nothing extraordinary as belonging to a homely northern farmer, with a stubborn countenance and stalwart limbs set out to advantage in knee breeches and gaiters. Such an individual seated in his armchair, his mug of ale frothing on the round table before him, is to be seen in any circuit of 5 or 6 miles among these hills, if you go at the right time after dinner. But Mr. Heathcliff forms a singular contrast to his abode and style of living. He is a dark-skinned gypsy in aspect, in dress and manners a gentleman, that is, as much a gentleman as many a country squire, rather slovenly, perhaps, yet not looking amiss with his negligence, because he has an erect and handsome figure, and rather morose. Possibly, some people might suspect him of a degree of underbred pride. I have a sympathetic chord within that tells me that it is nothing of the sort. I know, by instinct, his reserve springs from an aversion to showy displays of feeling, to manifestations of mutual kindliness. He'll love and hate equally under cover, and esteem it a species of impertinence to be loved or hated again. No, I'm running on too fast. I bestow my own attributes over liberally on him. Mr. Heathcliff may have entirely dissimilar reasons for keeping his hand out of the way when he meets a would-be acquaintance. To those which actuate me, let me hope my constitution is almost peculiar. My dear mother used to say I should never have a comfortable home, and only last summer I proved myself perfectly unworthy of one. While enjoying a month of fine weather at the sea-coast, I was thrown into the company of a most fascinating creature, a real goddess in my eyes, as long as she took no notice of me. I never told my love vocally. Still, if looks have language, the merest idiot might have guessed I was over head and ears. She understood me at last, and looked a return, the sweetest of all imaginable looks. And what did I do? I confess it with shame, shrunk icily into myself, like a snail. At every glance retired colder and farther, till finally the poor innocent was led to doubt her own senses, and, overwhelmed with confusion at her supposed mistake, persuaded her mamma to decamp. By this curious turn of disposition, I have gained the reputation of deliberate heartlessness. How undeserved, I alone can appreciate. I took a seat at the end of the hearthstone opposite that towards which my landlord advanced, and filled up on an interval of silence by attempting to caress the canine mother, who had left her nursery, and was sneaking wolfishly to the back of my legs, her lip curled up and her white teeth watering for a snatch. My caress provoked a long, guttural snarl. "You'd better let the dog alone," growled Mr. Heathcliff in unison, checking fiercer demonstrations with a punch of his foot. "She's not accustomed to be spoiled. Not kept for a pet." Then, striding to a side door, he shouted again, "Joseph!" Joseph mumbled indistinctly in the depths of the cellar, but gave no intimation of ascending, so his master dived down to him, leaving me vis-a-vis the ruffianly bitch and a pair of grim, shaggy sheep-dogs, who shared with her a jealous guardianship over all my movements. Not anxious to come in contact with their fangs, I sat still, but, imagining they would scarcely understand tacit insults, I unfortunately indulged in winking and making faces at the trio, and some turn of my physiognomy so irritated Madame that she suddenly broke into a fury and leapt on my knees. I flung her back. and hastened to interpose the table between us. This proceeding aroused the whole hive. Half a dozen four-footed fiends of various sizes and ages issued from hidden dens to the common center. I felt my heels and coat laps peculiar subjects of assault, and parrying off the larger combatants as effectually as I could with the poker, I was constrained to demand, aloud, assistance from some of the household in re-establishing peace. Mr. Heathcliff and his man climbed the cellar steps with vexatious phlegm. There's a note after phlegm. It says indolence, indifference. I don't think they moved 1 second faster than usual, though the hearth was an absolute tempest of worrying and yelping. Happily, an inhabitant of the kitchen made more dispatch. A lusty dame, with tucked-up gown, bare arms, and fire-flushed cheeks, rushed into the midst of us, flourishing a frying pan, and used that weapon and her tongue to such purpose that the storm subsided magically, and she only remained, heaving like a sea after a high wind, when her master entered onto the scene. "What the devil is the matter?" he asked, eyeing me in a manner that I could ill endure after his inhospitable treatment. "What the devil, indeed," I muttered. "The herd of possessed swine could have had no worse spirits in them than those animals of yours, sir. You might as well leave a stranger with a brood of tigers." "They won't meddle with persons who touch nothing," he remarked, putting the bottle before me, and restoring the displaced table. "The dogs do right to be vigilant. Take a glass of wine?" "No, thank you." "Not bitten, are you?" If I had been, I would have set my signet on the biter. Heathcliff's countenance relaxed into a grin. There's a note after biter, and it says, "Struck the dog with the signet ring." Poor puppy. "Come," he said, "you are flurried, Mr. Lockwood. Here, take a little wine. Guests are so exceedingly rare in this house that I and my dogs, I am willing to own, hardly know how to receive them. Your health, sir?" I bowed and returned the pledge, beginning to perceive that it would be foolish to sit sulking for the misbehavior of a pack of curs. Besides, I felt loath to yield the fellow further amusement at my expense, since his humor took that turn. He, probably swayed by a prudential consideration of the folly of offending a good tenant, relaxed a little in the laconic style of chipping off his pronouns and auxiliary verbs, and introduced what he supposed would be a subject of interest to me, a discourse on the advantages and disadvantages of my present place of retirement. I found him very intelligent on the topics we touched, and before I went home, I was encouraged so far as to volunteer another visit tomorrow. He evidently wished no repetition of my intrusion. I shall go, notwithstanding. It is astonishing how sociable I feel myself compared with him. End of chapter 1. All right, so we're introduced to Heathcliff. Amazing. A little standoffish, a little gruff. And so we have Mr. Lockwood, who is the narrator and who is telling the story, coming up to Wuthering Heights, which is the name of the manor. And in doing so, we meet Heathcliff, who is the owner of this estate, and Heathcliff goes to get a drink, I don't know, get things settled for Mr. Lockwood. And while he's gone, he warns Mr. Lockwood, like, my dogs aren't pets, so proceed with your own caution. And while he's gone, of course, Mr. Lockwood is like, puppies? Darn tootin', I'm gonna play with them. So he starts making faces at the dogs, and the dogs don't really like it. They start like growling and like jumping up, and it scares Mr. Lockwood, as it would a strange dog doing that, and he's like crying out for help, and somebody from the kitchen comes out, and then Heathcliff returns and is like, what is going on? And that is the introduction that we have. And at the end of it, we have a note that says, like, I left, like, saying that I would come back. And Heathcliff's like, you don't really need to do that. And leaving, I felt like I was a sociable person, at least in comparison to Heathcliff. So that's cool. You always have those people that are like you think that you're not social, or you think like you're a certain way, and then you meet somebody who is like way more, and you're like, oh, I guess I am pretty social. I guess I can hold up a conversation, or like whatever it is. That little wake up call. All right. Chapter 2. Yesterday afternoon, set in misty and cold. I had half a mind to spend it by my study fire, instead of wading through heath and mud to Wuthering Heights. On coming up from dinner, however, N.B., there's a note right there, and it says nota bene, Latin, mark well, or take notice. So, N.B., take notice. I dined between 12 and 1 o'clock. The housekeeper, a matronly lady, taken as a fixture along with the house, could not, or would not, comprehend my request that I might be served at 5. On mounting the stairs with this lazy intention and stepping into the room, I saw a servant girl, on her knees surrounded by brushes and coal scuttles, and raising an infernal dust as she extinguished the flames, with heaps of cinders. This spectacle drove me back immediately. I took my hat and, after a 4 miles walk, arrived at Heathcliff's garden gate just in time to escape the first feathery flakes of a snow shower. On that bleak hilltop the earth was hard with a black frost, and the air made me shiver through every limb, being unable to remove the chain I jumped over, and, running up the flagged causeway, bordered with straggling gooseberry bushes, knocked vainly for admittance, till my knuckles tingled and the dogs howled. Wretched inmates, I shouted mentally. You deserve perpetual isolation from your species for your churlish inhospitality. At least I would not keep my doors barred in the daytime. I don't care. I will get in. So resolved, I grasped the latch and shook it vehemently. Vinegar-faced Joseph projected his head from a round window of the barn. "What are you for?" he shouted. "To maesters down into fold. Go round by the end of the lathe, if you want to spake to 'em." Oh man. Okay. There's a footnote after that, and it has the like translation. And it says, "What do you want? The master is down in the fold," which is an enclosure for domestic animals. "Go round by the end of the barn if you want to speak to him." There we go. "Is there nobody inside to open the door?" I hallooned responsively. "There's nobbut to missus, and she'll not open tin ye make your flavesome dins till neat." There's a note. It says, "There's no one here but the missus, and she won't open it even if you make your terrible noise till night." Oh boy. Okay. "Why? Can't you tell me whom I am, eh, Joseph?" "Nor to me. I had no hint wi't." And there's a note after that, and it says, "Not I. I'll have no hand in this," muttered the head, vanishing. Oh boy. The snow began to drive thickly. I seized the handle to easy another trial, when a young man without coat and shouldering a pitchfork appeared in the yard behind. He hailed me to follow him, and after marching through a wash-house and a paved area containing a coal shed, pump, and pigeon cot, we at length arrived in the huge, warm, cheerful apartment where I was formerly received. There is a note after pigeon cot, and it says, "Coop." It glowed delightfully in the radiance of an immense fire, compounded of coal, peat, and wood, and near the table, laid for a plentiful evening meal, I was pleased to observe the Mrs., an individual whose existence I had never previously suspected. I bowed and waited, thinking she would bid me take a seat. She looked at me, leaning back in her chair, and remained motionless and mute. "Rough weather," I remarked. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Heathcliff, the door must bear the consequence of your servants' leisure attendance. I had hard work to make them hear me." She never opened her mouth. I stared. She stared also. At any rate, she kept her eyes on me in a cool, regardless manner, exceedingly embarrassing and disagreeable. "Sit down," said the young man gruffly. "He'll be in soon." I obeyed, and hemmed and called the villain Juno, who deigned at this second interview to move the extreme tip of her tail in token of owing my acquaintance. "Beautiful animal," I commenced again. "Do you intend parting with the little ones, madam?" "They are not mine," said the amiable hostess, more repellingly than Heathcliff himself could have replied. "Ah, your favorites are among these," I continued, turning to an obscure cushionful of something like cats. "A strange choice of favorites," she observed scornfully. Unluckily, it was a heap of dead rabbits. I hemmed once more, and drew closer to the hearth, repeating my comment on the wilderness of the evening. "You should not have come out," she said, rising and reaching from the chimney-piece 2 of the painted canisters. Her position before was sheltered from the light. Now I had a distinct view of her whole figure and countenance. She was slender and, apparently, scarcely past girlhood, an admirable form, and the most exquisite little face that I had ever had the pleasure of beholding. Small features, very fair, flaxen ringlets, or rather golden, hanging loose on her delicate neck, and eyes, had they been agreeable in expression, that would have been irresistible. Fortunately for my susceptible heart, the only sentiment they evinced hovered between scorn and a kind of desperation, singularly unnatural to be detected there. The canisters were almost out of her reach. I made a motion to aid her. She turned upon me as a miser might turn if any one attempted to assist him in counting his gold. "I don't want your help," she snapped. "I can get them for myself." "I beg your pardon," I hastened to reply. "Were you asked to tea?" she demanded, tying an apron over her neat black frock and standing with a spoonful of the leaf poised over the pot. "I shall be glad to have a cup," I answered. "Were you asked?" she repeated. "No," I said, half smiling. "You are the proper person to ask me." She flung the tea back, spoon and all, and resumed her chair in a pet. There's a note right there, and it says, "in a sulky mood." Her forehead corrugated and her red underlip pushed out like a child's, ready to cry. Meanwhile, the young man had slung on to his person a decidedly shabby upper garment, and, erecting himself before the blaze, looked down on me from the corner of his eyes, for all the world as if there were some mortal feud unavenged between us. I began to doubt whether he were a servant or not. His dress and speech were both rude, entirely devoid of the superiority observable in Mr. and Mrs. Heathcliff. His thick brown curls were rough and uncultivated. His whiskers encroached bearishly over his cheeks, and his hands were embrowned like those of a common laborer. Still his bearing was free, almost haughty, and he showed none of the domestic's assiduity in attending on the lady of the house. In the absence of clear proofs of his condition, I deemed it best to abstain from noticing his curious conduct, and 5 minutes afterwards the entrance of Heathcliff relieved me, in some measure, from my uncomfortable state. "Ah, you see, sir, I am come according to promise," I explained, assuming the cheerful, "and I fear I shall be weather-bound for half an hour, if you can afford me shelter during the space." "Half an hour," he said, shaking the white flakes from his clothes. "I wonder you should select the thick of a snowstorm to ramble about in. Do you know that you run a risk of being lost in the marshes? People familiar with these moors often miss their road on such evenings, and I can tell you there is no chance of a change at present." "Perhaps I can get a guide among your lads, and he might stay at the Grange till morning. Could you spare me one?" "No, I could not." "Oh, indeed. Well then, I must trust to my own sagacity." "Hm. Are you going to mak the tea?" demanded he of the shabby coat, shifting his ferocious gaze from me to the young lady. "Is he to have any?" she asked, appealing to Heathcliff. "Get it ready, will you?" was the answer, uttered so savagely that I started. The tone in which the words were said revealed a genuine bad nature. I no longer felt inclined to call Heathcliff a capital fellow. When the preparations were finished, he invited me with, "Now, sir, bring forward your chair," and we all, including the rustic fellow, drew round the table, in austere silence prevailing while we discussed our meal. And there's a note after discussed, and it is consumed, and then in parentheses, a facetious usage. I thought, if I had caused the cloud, it was my duty to make an effort to dispel it. They could not every day sit so grim and taciturn, and it was impossible, however ill-tempered they might be, that the universal scowl they wore was their every-day countenance. "It is strange," I began in the interval of swallowing one cup of tea and receiving another, "it is strange how custom can mould our tastes and ideas. Many could not imagine the existence of happiness in a life of such complete exile from the world as you spend, Mr. Heathcliff. Yet I'll venture to say that, surrounded by your family and with your amiable lady as the presiding genius over your home and heart—" "My amiable lady," he interrupted, with an almost diabolical sneer on his face. "Where is she, my amiable lady?" "Mrs. Heathcliff. Your wife, I mean." "Well, yes. Oh, you would intimate that her spirit has taken the post of ministering angel, and guards the fortunes of Wuthering Heights, even when her body is gone? Is that it?" Perceiving myself in a blunder, I attempted to correct it. I might have seen there was too great a disparity between the ages of the parties to make it likely that they were man and wife. One was about 40, a period of mental vigor at which men seldom cherish the delusion of being married for love by girls. That dream is reserved for the solace of our declining years. The other did not look 17. Then it flashed upon me. The clown at my elbow, who is drinking his tea out of a basin and eating his bread with unwashed hands, may be her husband. Heathcliff Jr., of course. Here is the consequence of being buried alive. She has thrown herself away upon that bore of sheer ignorance that better individuals existed. Sad pity. I must beware how I cause her to regret her choice. The last reflection may seem conceited. It was not. My neighbor struck me as bordering on repulsive. I knew, through experience, that I was tolerably attractive. "Mrs. Heathcliff is my daughter-in-law," said Heathcliff, corroborating my surmise. He turned, as he spoke, a peculiar look in her direction, a look of hatred, unless he has a most perverse set of facial muscles that will not, like those of other people, interpret the language of his soul. "Ah, certainly, I see now. You are the favored possessor of the beneficent fairy, I remarked, turning to my neighbor. This was worse than before. The youth grew crimson and clenched his fist, with every appearance of a meditated assault. But he seemed to recollect himself presently, and smothered the storm in a brutal curse, muttered on my behalf, which, however, I took care not to notice. "Unhappy in your conjectures, sir," observed my host. "We neither of us have the privilege of owning your good fairy. Her mate is dead. I said she was my daughter-in-law, therefore she must have married my son." "And this young man is—" "Not my son, assuredly." Heathcliff smiled again, as if it were rather too bold a jest to attribute the paternity of that bear to him. "My name is Catherine Earnshaw," growled the other, "and I'd counsel you to respect it." "I've shown no disrespect," was my reply, laughing internally at the dignity with which he announced himself. He fixed his eye on me longer than I cared to return the stare, for fear I might be tempted either to box his ears or render my hilarity audible. I began to feel unmistakably out of place in that pleasant family circle. The dismal spiritual atmosphere overcame, and more than neutralized, the glowing physical comforts round me, and I resolved to be cautious how I ventured under those rafters a third time. The business of eating being concluded, and no one uttered a word of sociable conversation, I approached a window to examine the weather. A sorrowful sight I was. Dark night coming down prematurely, and sky and hills mingled in one bitter whirl of wind and suffocating snow. "I don't think it possible for me to get home now without a guide," I could not help exclaiming. "The roads will be buried already, and if they were bare I could scarcely distinguish a foot in advance." "Ayrton, drive those dozen sheep into the barn porch. They'll be covered if left in the folds of night, and put a plank before them," said Heathcliff. "How must I do—" I continued with rising irritation. There was no reply to my question, and on looking round I saw only Joseph bringing in a pail of porridge for the dogs, and Mrs. Heathcliff leaning over the fire, diverting herself with burning a bundle of matches which had fallen from the chimney-piece, as she restored a tea canister to its place. The former, when he had deposited his burden, took a critical survey of the room, and in cracked tones grated out, "I wonder how you can fashion to stand it in idlesse unwar, when all on 'em's going out. But you're and now, and it's no use talking, y'all never mind our ill ways, but go right to devil, like your mother before you." There's a note. "Thank you for this note," it says. "I wonder how you dare to stand there in idleness, and worse, when all of them have gone out. But you're a nothing, and it's no use talking. You'll never give up your bad ways, but go right to the devil, like your mother before you." I imagined, for a moment, that this piece of eloquence was addressed to me, and, sufficiently enraged, stepped towards the aged rascal with an intention of kicking him out the door. Mrs. Heathcliff, however, checked me by her answer. "You scandalous old hypocrite," she replied, "are you not afraid of being carried away bodily whenever you mention the devil's name? I warn you to refrain from provoking me, or I'll ask your abduction as a special favor. Stop! Look here, Joseph," she continued, taking a long, dark book from a shelf. "I'll show you how far I've progressed in the black art. I shall soon be competent to make a clear house of it. The red cow didn't die by chance, and your rheumatism can hardly be reckoned among providential visitations." "Ah, wicked, wicked," gasped the elder. "May the Lord deliver us from evil." "No, reprobate. You are a castaway. Be off, or I'll hurt you seriously. I'll have you all modelled in wax and clay, and the first who passes the limits I fix I'll not say what he shall be done to, but you'll see. Go. I'm looking at you." The little witch put a mock malignity into her beautiful eyes, and Joseph, trembling with sincere horror, rushed out, praying and shouting "wicked" as he went. I thought her conduct must be prompted by a species of dreary fun, and now that we were alone, I endeavoured to interest her in my distress. "Mrs. Heathcliff," I said earnestly, "you must excuse me for troubling you. I presume, because with that face I'm sure you cannot help being good-hearted. Do point out some landmarks by which I may know my way home. I have no more idea how to get there than you would at how to get to London." "Take the road you came," she answered, ensconcing herself in a chair with a candle and the long book open before her. "It is brief advice, but as sound as I can give." "Then if you hear me being discovered dead in a bog or a pit of snow, your conscience won't whisper that it is partly your fault?" "How so? I cannot escort you. They wouldn't let me go to the end of the garden wall." You? I should be sorry to ask you to cross the threshold for my inconvenience on such a night," I cried. "I want you to tell me my way, not to show it, or else to persuade Mr. Heathcliff to give me a guide." "Who? There is himself, Earnshaw, Zillah, Joseph, and I. Which would you have?" "Are there no boys at the farm?" "No, those are all." "Then it follows that I am compelled to stay." "That you may settle with your host. I have nothing to do with it." "I hope it will be a lesson to you to make no more rash journeys on these hills," cried Heathcliff's stern voice from the kitchen entrance. "As to staying here, I don't keep accommodations for visitors. You must share a bed with Hareton, or Joseph, if you do." "I can sleep on the chair in this room," I replied. "No, no. A stranger is a stranger, be he rich or poor. It will not suit me to permit any one the range of the place while I am off guard," said the unmannerly wretch. With this insult my patience was at an end. I uttered an expression of disgust, and pushed past him into the yard, running against Earnshaw in my haste. It was so dark that I could not see the means of exit, and, as I wandered round, I heard another specimen of their civil behaviour amongst each other. At first the young man appeared about to befriend me. "I'll go with him, as far as the park," said he. "You'll go with him to hell," exclaimed his master, or whatever relation he bore. "And who is to look after the horses, eh?" "A man's life is of more consequence than one's evening's neglect of the horses. Somebody must go," murmured Mrs. Heathcliff, more kindly than I expected. "Not at your command," retorted Hareton. "If you set store on him, you'd better be quiet." "Then I hope his ghost will haunt you, and I hope Mr. Heathcliff will never get another tenant till the Grange is a ruin," she answered sharply. Harkin, shoe's cursin' on 'em," muttered Joseph, towards whom I had been steering. He sat within earshot, milking the cows by a light of a lantern which I seized unceremoniously, and, calling out that I would send it back on the morrow, rushed to the nearest postern. Maester, he's stolen the lantern," shouted the ancient, pursuing my retreat. "Hey, Nasher, hey, dog, hey, wolf, hold him, hold him!" On opening the little door, two hairy monsters flew at my throat, bearing me down and extinguishing the light, while a mingled guffaw from Heathcliff and Hareton put the copstone on my rage and humiliation. And there is a note right after copstone, and it says headstone, or top of a building, hence the finishing touch. Fortunately, the beasts seemed more bent on stretching their paws, and yawning and flourishing their tails, than devouring me alive. But they would suffer no resurrection, and I was forced to lie till their malignant masters pleased to deliver me. Then, hatless and trembling with wrath, I ordered the miscreants to let me out, on their peril to keep me 1 minute longer, with several incoherent threats of retaliation that, in their indefinite depth of virulency, smacked of King Lear. The vehemence of my agitation brought on a copious bleeding at the nose, and still Heathcliff laughed, and still I scolded. I don't know what would have concluded the scene, had there not been one person at hand rather more rational than myself, and more benevolent than my entertainer. This was Zillah, the stout housewife, who at length issued forth to inquire into the nature of the uproar. She thought that some of them had been laying violent hands on me, and, not daring to attack her master, she turned her vocal artillery against the younger scoundrel. "Well, Mr Earnshaw," she cried, "I wonder what you'll have next." "What you'll have agate next." And there's a note after agate, and it says a-going. There you go. "Are we going to murder folk on our very door-stones? I see this house will never do for me. Look at poor lad. He's fair choking. Wisht, wisht." There's a note right there, and it says, "Hush, be quiet. Wisht, wisht. You mustn't go on so. Come on, I'll cure that. There now, hold ye still." With these words, she suddenly splashed a pint of icy water down my neck, and pulled me into the kitchen. Mr Heathcliff followed, his accidental merriment expiring quickly in his habitual moroseness. I was sick exceedingly, and dizzy and faint, and thus compelled perforce to accept lodgings under his roof. He told Zillah to give me a glass of brandy, and then passed on to the inner room, while she condoled me, while she condoled with me on my sorry predicament, and having obeyed his orders, whereby I was somewhat revived, ushered me to bed. End of chapter 2. Okay, we're getting more insight into the weirdness and super unwelcoming Heathcliff, but also everybody else there is not very welcoming. So we have Mr. Lockwood, who is a tenant, and he promised the day before that he was going to come and see and visit Heathcliff again. So the time has come. He's going to go over there just like he said he was going to, and he bundles up, and it's a cold, dreary day, and he gets there, and by the time he gets there, as soon as he arrives, it starts snowing pretty heavily. He's having a time trying to get in, and people just make things more difficult, and they're just like, "Well, were you invited?" And he's like, "Well, like, I came like I said that I was going to come." And so the guy who answers the door, Joseph, doesn't really do much for help. But he invites him in and tells him to, like, go hang out with the missus. So he's hanging out, Mr. Lockwood is hanging out with the missus and assumes that she is married to Heathcliff. She is Mrs. Heathcliff, he is Heathcliff, and is, addressing her as such and talking with her as such. It turns out that is not the case. She is the wife of his son. It's silly. So Mr. Heathcliff's wife is dead, from what I have gathered, unless I just completely misread that. And it's just wild. And so she's about to make tea and is just like, "Wait, were you invited to tea?" And he doesn't really answer. He's like, "Well, like, I'm here like I said I was going to be." And she's like, "Were you invited for tea?" And he's like, "Well, no, you would be the one to invite me for tea." And so she just, like, stops making tea, and then Heathcliff comes up, and they're all sitting around, and Mr. Lockwood is like, "I told you I would come, and here I am." And it is so awkward and uncomfortable, and Mr. Lockwood can't leave quite yet. He has asked a couple different people if he would be able to get a guide to help him go back, because he's not going to be able to get back without any of the, like, landmarks or seeing the path or anything. Like, he just got to this place. He doesn't know the area and he just wants to go back, it sounds like. And nobody's really helping him. He's like, okay, well, the other option is if he doesn't have a guide or have landmarks or anything like that, then like he has to stay over because he doesn't know how to get there and he's just gonna like fall in a ditch. And so they're like, well, you can't stay, basically. So he starts to leave and he's asking for landmarks and directions, and it's just not working. And he like runs into some animals, and there's like a whole hullabaloo. And then Zilla, who's the house manager, thinks that they're attacking him, and she comes out and is like, what is happening? You can't leave. Come in here, come into the house. And so now he is taking a bed. He's like, I don't need a bed. I can just sleep in this chair in this room and not disturb anybody. And Heathcliff is like, no, you're gonna have a bed. This is so uncomfortable to be in this situation. I would feel wildly uncomfortable, and I feel like I might even be safer just muddling my way, trying to find my way home. Like, what is happening? What is going on? I don't know. So, so Lockwood has stayed the night, or is going to stay the night. Let's see how it goes. Let's see. Chapter 3. While leading the way upstairs, she recommended that I should hide the candle and do not make a noise, for her master had an odd notion about the chamber she would put me in, and never let anybody lodge there willingly. Odd. I asked the reason. She did not know, she answered. She had only lived there a year or two, and they had so many odd goings on. She could not begin to be curious. Too stupefied to be curious myself, I fastened my door and glanced round for the bed. The whole furniture consisted of a chair, a clothes press, and a large oak case, with squares cut out near the top resembling coach windows. And we have two notes. One after clothes press, which is a cupboard with shelves for storing clothing. And then the next is after oak case, which is an enclosed bed. Cute. Having approached this structure, I looked inside and perceived it to be a singular sort of old-fashioned couch, very conveniently designed to obviate the necessity for every member of the family having a room to himself. In fact, it formed a little closet, and the ledge of a window which it enclosed served as a table. I slid back the paneled sides, got in with my light, pulled them together again, and felt secure against the vigilance of Heathcliff and everyone else. The ledge, where I placed my candle, had a few mildewed books piled up in one corner, and it was covered with writing scratched on the paint. This writing, however, was nothing but a name repeated in all kinds of characters, large and small. Catherine Earnshaw here, and there varied to Catherine Heathcliff, and then again to Catherine Linton. In vapid listlessness, I leant my head against the window, and continued spelling over Catherine Earnshaw, Heathcliff, Linton, till my eyes closed. But they had not rested 5 minutes when a glare of white letters started from the dark, as vivid as spectres. The air swarmed with Catherines, and rousing myself to dispel the obtrusive name, I observed my candle wick reclining on one of the antique volumes, and perfuming the place with an odor of roasted calf skin. I snuffed it out, and, very ill at ease, under the influence of cold and lingering nausea, sat up and spread open the injured tome of my knee. It was a testament in lean type and smelling dreadfully musty. A fly leaf bore the inscription, Catherine Earnshaw, her book, and a date some quarter of a century back. And we have a note after in lean type, and it says, oh, poor quality. There we go. So in poor quality handwriting, it has an inscription that says Catherine Earnshaw, her book, with a date. I shut it, and took up another, and another, till I had examined all. Catherine's library was select, and its state of dilapidation proved it to have been well used, though not altogether for a legitimate purpose. Scarcely one chapter had escaped, a pen and ink commentary, at least the appearance of one, covering every morsel of blank that the paper had left. Some were detached sentences, other parts took the form of a regular diary, scrawled in an unformed, childish hand. At the top of an extra page, quite a treasure, probably, when first lighted on, I was greatly amused to behold an excellent caricature of my friend Joseph, rudely yet powerfully sketched. An immediate interest kindled within me for the unknown Catherine, and I began forthwith to decipher her faded hieroglyphics. An awful Sunday, commenced the paragraph beneath. I wish my father were back again. Hindley is a detestable substitute. His conduct to Heathcliff is atrocious. H. and I are going to rebel. We took our initiatory steps this evening. All day had been flooding with rain. We could not go to church, so Joseph must needs get up a congregation in the garret, and, while Hindley and his wife basked downstairs before a comfortable fire, doing anything but reading their Bibles, I'll answer for it, Heathcliff, myself, and the unhappy ploughboy were commanded to take our prayer-books and mount. We were ranged in a row, on a sack of corn, groaning and shivering, and hoping that Joseph would shiver too, so that he might give us a short homily for his own sake. A vain idea. The service lasted precisely 3 hours, and yet my brother had the face to exclaim, when he saw us descending, "What, done already?" On Sunday evenings we were used to be permitted to play, if we did not make so much noise. Now a mere titter is sufficient to send us into corners. "You forget you have a master here," says the tyrant. "I'll demolish the first who puts me out of temper. I insist on perfect sobriety and silence. Oh, boy, was that you? Francis, darling, pull his hair as you go by." I heard him snap his fingers. Frances pulled his hair heartily, and then went and seated herself on her husband's knee, and there they were, like two babies, kissing and talking nonsense by the hour. Foolish palaver, that we should be ashamed of. We made ourselves as snug as our means allowed in the arch of the dresser. I had just fastened our pinafores together, and hung them up for a curtain, when in comes Joseph, on an errand from the stables. He tears down my handiwork, boxes my ears, and croak, "To Maester about just buried, and Sabbath not oered, on the sound o' the gospel still in your lungs, and ye dare be lakin. Shame on ye. Sit ye down, ill childer. There's good books enough for ye to read 'em. Sit ye down and think o' your scowls." Okay, so it says the master is hardly buried, and the Sabbath not over, and the sound of the gospel still in your ears, and you dare be playing. Oh my. Saying this, he compelled us to square our positions, that we might receive from the far-off fire a dull ray to show us the text of the lumber he thrust upon us. I could not bear the employment. I took my dingy volume by the scroop, and hurled it into the dog-kennel, vowing I hated a good book. There's a note after scroop, and it says back cover of a book. The spine! Heathcliff kicked his to the same place. Then there was a hubbub. "Maester Hindley," shouted our chaplain, "Maester, come hither. Miss Cathy's riven the back of the Hamlet Salvation." On Heathcliff paused his fit into the first part the Broadway to destruction. "It's fair flaysome, and ye let him get on his gait. Ich, thou'd man wad ha laced him properly. but he's gone. Note. Miss Cathy has ripped the back cover off the Helmet of Salvation, and Heathcliff has put his foot through the first part of the broad way to destruction. It's terrible that you let them go on this way. Oh, the old man would have whipped them properly, but he's dead. Hindley hurried up from his paradise on the hearth, and seizing one of us by the collar and the other by the arm, hurled both into the back kitchen, where Joseph asseverated Old Nick. A note after Old Nick, or the devil, would fetch us as sure as we were living, and so comforted, we each sought a separate nook to await his advent. I reached this book and a pot of ink from the shelf, and pushed the house door ajar to give me light, and I have got the time on writing for 20 minutes, but my companion is impatient, and proposes that we should appropriate the dairywoman's cloak, but I have a scamper on the moors under its shelter. A pleasant suggestion, and then if the surly old man come in, he may believe his prophecy verified. We cannot be damper or cold in the rain when we are here. I suppose Catherine fulfilled her project, for the next sentence took up another subject. She waxed lachrymose. How little did I dream that Hindley would ever make me cry so, she wrote. My head aches till I cannot keep it on the pillow, and still I can't give over. Poor Heathcliff! Hindley calls him a vagabond, and won't let him sit with us, nor eat with us any more. And, he says, he and I must not play together, and threatens to turn him out of the house if we break his orders. He has been blaming our father, how dare he, for treating H too liberally, and swears he will reduce him to his right place. I began to nod drowsily over the dim page. My eye wandered from manuscript to print. I saw a red ornamented title, 70 times 7, and the first of the 71st, a pious discourse delivered by the Reverend Branderham in the chapel of Gimmerden So. There's a note right there, and it says ditch. So means ditch. Got it. And while I was half-consciously worrying my brain to guess what Branderham would make of his subject, I sank back in bed and fell asleep. Alas for the effects of bad tea and bad temper! What else could it be that made me pass such a terrible night? I don't remember another that I can at all compare with it since I was capable of suffering. I began to dream, almost before I ceased to be sensible of my locality. I thought it was morning, and I had set out on my way home, with Joseph for a guide. The snow lay yards deep in our road, and, as we floundered on, my companion wearied me with constant reproaches that I had not brought a pilgrim's staff, telling me that I could never get into the house without one, and boastfully flourishing a heavy-headed cudgel, which I understood to be so denominated. For a moment I considered it absurd that I should need such a weapon to gain admittance to my own residence. Then a new idea flashed across me. I was not going there. We were journeying to hear the famous Branderham preach from the text 70 times 7, and either Joseph the preacher or I had committed the first of the 71st, and were we to be publicly exposed and excommunicated. When we came to the chapel, I have passed it really in my walks twice or thrice. It lies in a hollow between two hills, an elevated hollow near a swamp, whose peaty moisture is said to answer all the purposes of embalming on the few corpses deposited there. The roof had been kept whole hitherto, but as the clergyman's stipend is only £20 per annum, and a horse with 2 rooms threatening speedily to determine into one, no clergyman will undertake the duties of pastor. There is a note right after threatening speedily to determine into, and it says become, threatening speedily to become. especially as it is currently reported that his flock would rather let him starve than increase the living by 1 penny from their own pockets. However, in my dream, Jabez, the first name, had a full and attentive congregation, and he preached. Good God, what a sermon! Divided into 490 parts, each fully equal to an ordinary address from the pulpit, and each discussing a separate sin. Where he searched for them, I cannot tell. He had his private manner of interpreting the phrase, and it seemed necessary the brother should sin different sins on every occasion. They were of the most curious character, odd transgressions that I never imagined previously. How weary I grew, how I writhed and yawned and nodded and revived, how I pinched and pricked myself, and rubbed my eyes, and stood up and sat down again, and nudged Joseph to inform me if he would ever have done. I was condemned to hear all out. Finally, he reached the first of the 71st. At that crisis, a sudden inspiration descended on me. I was moved to rise and denounce Jabez Branderham as the sinner of the sin that no Christian need pardon. Sir, I exclaimed, sitting here within these 4 walls, at one stretch, I have endured and forgiven the 490 heads of your discourse. 70 times 7 times have I plucked up my hat and been about to depart. 70 times 7 times have you preposterously forced me to resume my seat. The 491st is too much. Fellow martyrs, have at him. Drag him down, and crush him to atoms, and the place which knows him may know him no more. Thou art the man, cried Jabez, after a solemn pause, leaning over his cushion. 70 times 7 times didst thou gapingly contort thy visage. 70 times 7 did I take counsel with my soul. Lo, this is human weakness. This also may be absolved. The first of the 71st is come. Brethren, execute upon him the judgment written. Such honor have all his saints. With that concluding word, the whole assembly, exalting their pilgrims' staffs, or rods, rushed round me in a body, and I, having no weapon to raise in self-defense, commenced grappling with Joseph, my nearest and most ferocious assailant, for his. In the confluence of the multitude, several clubs crossed. Blows aimed at me fell on other sconces, heads, or persons. Presently the whole chapel resounded with rappings and counter-rappings. Every man's head was against his neighbor, and Branderham, unwilling to remain idle, poured forth his zeal in a shower of loud taps on the boards of the pulpit, which responded so smartly that, at last, to my unspeakable relief, they woke me. And what was it that had suggested this tremendous tumult? What had played Jabez's part in the row? Merely the branch of a fir tree that touched my lattice as the blast wailed by, and rattled its dry cones against the panes. I listened doubtingly an instant, detected the disturber, then turned and dozed, and dreamt again, if possible, still more disagreeably than before. This time I remembered I was lying in the oak closet, and I heard distinctly the gusty wind and the driving of the snow. I heard also the fir bough repeat its teasing sound, and ascribed it to the right cause, but it annoyed me so much that I resolved to silence it, if possible, and, I thought, I rose and endeavoured to unhasp the casement. The hook was soldered into the staple, a circumstance observed by me when awake, but forgotten. I must stop it, nevertheless, I muttered, knocking my knuckles through the glass, and stretching an arm out to seize the importunate branch, instead of which My fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice-cold hand. The intense horror of nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholy voice sobbed, "Let me in. Let me in." "Who are you?" I asked, struggling meanwhile to disengage myself. "Catherine Linton," it replied, shiveringly. Why did I think of Linton? I had read Earnshaw 20 times for Linton. "I'm come home. I lost my way on the moor." As it spoke, I discerned, obscurely, a child's face looking through the window. Terror made me cruel, and finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist on the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it wailed, "Let me in," and maintained its tenacious gripe, almost maddening me with fear. "How can I?" I said at length. "Let me go, if you want me to let you in." The fingers relaxed. I snatched mine through the hole, hurriedly piled the books up in a pyramid against it, and stopped my ears to exclude the lamentable prayer. I seemed to keep them closed above a quarter of an hour, yet the instant I listened again, there was the doleful cry, moaning on. "Begone!" I shouted. "I'll never let you in, not if you beg for 20 years." "It is 20 years," mourned the voice. 20 years I've been a waif, for 20 years. Thereat began a feeble scratching sound, and the pile of books moved as if thrust forward. I tried to jump up, but could not stir a limb, and so yelled aloud in a frenzy of fright. To my confusion, I discovered the yell was not ideal. Hasty footsteps approached my chamber door. Somebody pushed it open with a vigorous hand, and a light— "Is anyone here?" I considered it best to confess my presence, for I knew Heathcliff's accents, and feared he might search further if I kept quiet. With this intention I turned and opened the panels. I shall not soon forget the effect my action. Heathcliff stood near the entrance, in his shirt and trousers, with a candle dripping over his fingers, and his face as white as the wall behind him. The first creak of the oak startled him like an electric shock. The light leaped from his hold to a distance of some feet, and his agitation was so extreme that he could hardly pick it up. "It is only your guest, sir," I called out, desirous to spare him the humiliation of exposing his cowardice further. "I had the misfortune to scream in my sleep, owing to a frightful nightmare. I'm sorry I disturbed you." "Oh, God confound you, Mr. Lockwood. I wish you were at the—" line dash. I'm guessing that you're supposed to just put in the name, some name of the place. That's cool. Commenced my host, setting the candle on a chair because he found it impossible to hold it steady. "And you showed up into this room," he continued, crushing his nails into his palm and grinding his teeth to subdue the maxillary convulsions. There's a note right there, and it says convulsions of the jaw. "Who was it? I've a good mind to turn them out of this house this moment." "It was your servant, Zillah," I replied, flinging myself onto the floor and rapidly resuming my garments. "I should not care if you did, Mr. Heathcliff. She richly deserves it. I suppose that she wanted to get another proof that the place was haunted, at my expense. Well, it is, swarming with ghosts and goblins. You have reason in shutting it up, I assure you. No one will thank you for a doze in such a den." "What do you mean?" asked Heathcliff. "And what are you doing? Lie down and finish out the night, since you are here. But for heaven's sake, don't repeat that horrid noise. Nothing could excuse it, unless you were having your throat cut." "If the little fiend had got in at the window, she probably would have strangled me," I returned. "I'm not going to endure the persecutions of your hospitable ancestors again. Was not the Reverend Branderham akin to you on the mother's side? and that minx, Catherine Linton, or Earnshaw, or however she was called, she must have been a changeling. Changeling. Another's child exchanged secretly for one's own, especially an undesirable child substituted by the fairies in place of one's own. Wicked little soul. She told me she had been walking the earth these 20 years, a just punishment for her mortal transgressions, I've no doubt. Scarcely were these words uttered when I recollected the association of Heathcliff's and Catherine's name in the book, which had completely slipped from my memory, till thus awakened. I blushed at my inconsideration, but without showing further consciousness of the offence, I hastened to add, "The truth is, sir, I passed the first part of the night in—" Here I stopped afresh. I was about to say, pursuing the old volumes. Then it would have revealed my knowledge of their written as well as their printed contents. So, correcting myself, I went on. In spelling over the names scratched on that window ledge, a monotonous occupation calculated to set me asleep, like counting, or what can you mean by talking in this way to me? thundered Heathcliff with savage vehemence. How dare you, under my roof? God, he's mad to speak so. And he struck his forehead with rage. I did not know whether to resent this language or pursue my explanation, but he seemed so powerfully affected that I took pity and proceeded with my dreams, affirming that I had never heard the appellation of Catherine Linton before, but reading it often overproduced an impression which personified itself, which I had no longer my imagination under control. Heathcliff gradually fell back into the shelter of the bed as I spoke. Finally sitting down almost concealed behind it, I guessed, however, by his irregular and intercepted breathing, that he struggled to vanquish an excess of violent emotion. Not liking to show him that I had heard the conflict, I continued my toilette rather noisily, looking at my watch and soliloquized on the length of the night. Not 3 o'clock yet. I could have taken oath it had been 6. Time stagnates here. We must surely have retired to rest at 8. Always at 9 in winter, and rise at 4, said my host, suppressing a groan, and as I fancied by the motion of his arm's shadow, dashing a tear from his eyes. Mr. Lockwood, he added, you may go into my room. You'll only be in the way, coming downstairs so early, and your childish outcry has sent sleep to the devil for me. And for me too, I replied. I'll walk in the yard till daylight, and then I'll be off, and you need not dread a repetition of my intrusion. I'm now quite cured of seeking pleasure in society, be it country or town. A sensible man ought to find sufficient company in himself. Delightful company, muttered Heathcliff. Take the candle and go where you please. I shall join you directly. Keep out of the yard, though. The dogs are unchained, and the house. Juno mounts sentinel there, and, nay, you can only ramble about the steps and passages, but away with you. I'll come in 2 minutes. I obeyed, so far as to quit the chamber, when, ignorant where the narrow lobbies led, I stood still, and was witness involuntarily to a piece of superstition on the part of my landlord which belied, oddly, his apparent sense. He got on to the bed and wrenched open the lattice, bursting as he pulled at it into an uncontrollable passion of tears. Come in, he sobbed. Cathy, do come. Oh, do once more. Oh, my heart's darling, hear me this time. Catherine, at last. The spectre showed a spectre's ordinary caprice. It gave no sign of being, but the snow and wind whirled wildly through, even reaching my station and blowing out the light. There was such anguish in the gush of grief that accompanied this raving, that my compassion made me overlook its folly, and I drew off, half angry to have listened at all, and vexed at having related my ridiculous nightmare, since it produced that agony, though why was beyond my comprehension. I descended cautiously to the lower regions, and landed in the back kitchen, where a gleam of fire, raked compactly together, enabled me to rekindle my candle. Nothing was stirring except a brindled grey cat, which crept from the ashes and saluted me with querulous mew. 2 benches, shaped in sections of a circle, nearly enclosed the hearth. On one of these I stretched myself, and Grimalkin mounted the other. We were both of us nodding ere anyone invaded our retreat, and then it was Joseph, shuffling down a wooden ladder that vanquished in the roof through a trap the ascent to the garret, I suppose. He cast a sinister look at the little flame which I had enticed to play between the ribs, swept the cat from its elevation, and bestowing himself in the vacancy, commenced the operation of stuffing a 3-inch pipe with tobacco. My presence in his sanctum was evidently esteemed a piece of imprudence too shameful for remark. He silently applied the tube to his lips, folded his arms, and puffed away. I let him enjoy the luxury unannoyed, and after sucking out his last reef and heaving a profound sigh, he got up and departed as solemnly as he came. A more elastic footstep entered next, and now I opened my mouth for a good morning, but closed it again. The salutation unachieved, for Catherine Earnshaw was performing his orison sotto voce, a hymn sung softly, and a series of curses directed against every object he touched, while he rummaged a corner for a spade or shovel to dig through the drifts. He glanced over the back of the bench, dilating his nostrils, and thought as little of exchanging civilities with me as with my companion, the cat. I guessed, by his preparations, that egress was allowed, and, leaving my hard couch, made a movement to follow him. He noticed this, and thrust at an inner door with the end of his spade, intimating by an inarticulate sound that there was the place where I must go if I changed my locality. It opened into the house, where the females were already astir, Zillah urging flakes of flame up the chimney with a colossal bellows, and Mrs. Heathcliff kneeling on the hearth, reading a book by the aid of the blaze. She held her hand interposed between the furnace heat and her eyes, and seemed absorbed in her occupation, desisting from it only to chide the servant for covering her with sparks, or to put away a dog, now and then, that snoozled its nose over forwardly into her face. I was surprised to see Heathcliff there also. He stood by the fire, his back towards me, just finishing a stormy scene with poor Zillah, who ever and anon interrupted her labor to pluck up the corner of her apron and heave an indignant groan. "And you worthless," he broke out as I entered, turning to his daughter-in-law and employing an epithet as harmless as duck or sheep, but generally represented by a dash. "There you are, at your idle tricks again. The rest of them do earn their bread. You live on my charity. Put your trash away and find something to do. You shall pay me for the plague of having you eternally in my sight. Do you hear, damnable jade?" And damnable jade means hussy. Oh. "I'll put my trash away, because you can make me if I refuse," answered the young lady, closing her book and throwing it on a chair. "But I'll not do anything, though you should swear your tongue out, except what I please." Heathcliff lifted his hand, and the speaker sprang to a safer distance. Obviously acquainted with its weight, Having no desire to be entertained by a cat or dog combat, I stepped forward briskly, as if eager to partake the warmth of the hearth, and innocent of any knowledge of the interrupted dispute. Each had enough decorum to suspend further hostilities. Heathcliff placed his fists, out of temptation, in his pockets. Mrs. Heathcliff curled her lip and walked to a seat far off, where she kept her word by playing the part of a statue during the remainder of my stay. That was not long. I declined joining their breakfast, and, at the first gleam of dawn, took an opportunity of escaping into the free air, now clear and still and cold as impalpable ice. My landlord hallooed for me to stop ere I reached the bottom of the gardens, and offered to accompany me across the moor. It was well he did, for the whole hill-back was one billowy white ocean, the swells and falls not indicating corresponding rises and depressions in the ground. Many pits, at least, were filled to a level, and entire ranges of mounds, the refuse of the quarries, blotted from the chart from which my yesterday's walk left pictured in my mind. I had remarked on one side of the road, at intervals of 6 or 7 yards, a line of upright stones, continued through the whole length of the barren. These were erected and daubed with lime on purpose to serve as guides in the dark, and also, when a fall, like a present, confounded the deep swamps on either hand with the firmer path, but, excepting a dirty dot pointing up here and there, all traces of their existence had vanished, and my companion found it necessary to warn me frequently to steer on the left or right when I imagined I was following correctly the windings of the road. We exchanged little conversation, and he halted at the entrance of Thrushcross Park, saying I could make no error there. Our adieux were limited to a hasty bow, and then I pushed forward, trusting to my own resources, for the porter's lodge is untenanted as yet. The distance from the gate to the Grange is 2 miles. I believe I managed to make it 4, what with losing myself among the trees and sinking up to the neck in snow. A predicament which only those who have experienced it can appreciate. At any rate, whatever were my wanderings, the clock chimed 12 as I entered the house, and that gave exactly an hour for every mile of the usual way from Wuthering Heights. My human fixture and her satellites rushed to welcome me, exclaiming tumultuously they had completely given me up. Everybody conjectured that I perished last night, and they were wondering how they must set about the search for my remains. I bid them be quiet, now that they saw me returned, and, benumbed to my very heart, I dragged upstairs, whence, after putting on dry clothes and pacing to and fro 30 or 40 minutes to restore the animal heat, I adjourned to my study, feeble as a kitten, almost too much so to enjoy the cheerful fire and smoking coffee which the servant had prepared for my refreshment. End of chapter 3. Okay, so this chapter, he's about to leave into the middle of the night, and Zilla is like, excuse me, don't be silly, stay here. I'm gonna take you into this room that nobody goes into willingly. Cool, amazing. Nobody, and she was unable to, like, give an answer why. She just knows that odd things happen. She's only been in this house for 1 or 2 years, and can't give a straight answer. So Mr. Lockwood is going through things, like looking around. He sees 3 names written. Catherine, oh man, I forgot, Earnshaw, Catherine Heathcliff, and Catherine Linton. And he is going through books, and the books are just littered with writings, and he's reading some of them, and as he's reading some of them, he falls asleep, and he thinks that he wakes up and that Joseph is taking him to his home as a guide the next day. But what's really happening is he's dreaming, And him and Joseph are walking to a church because that was the last thing he read about. And so he's walking to the church and he's just having this weird dream with this pastor going on and on and on. And then everybody's fighting in the like aisles. And it's just weird. And then he wakes up because there's a branch outside that's like scraping against the window. So he wakes up and he sees somebody out there. And so he goes to the window and he opens the window and he thinks that he's like holding, like gonna grab like the branch of the tree, and cold, dead little fingers grab onto him. And he hears this voice asking to be let in. And I mean, in all of the everything I've seen or read, obviously you need to immediately let them in. No, that's terrifying. So he's like trying to get this hand off of him, and he finally does, and he's like screaming and yelling this whole time. And then Heathcliff comes in and he's like, "What are you doing? Who are you?" Heathcliff didn't know that Lockwood was staying the night, and Lockwood was like, "Oh, yeah, Zillow let me stay. Sorry about the screaming. I had a dream. Sorry about that." And so Heathcliff is like, all right, well, whatever, you can stay. It's all very odd. So Lockwood goes downstairs. He hears Heathcliff like talking to the ghost, the specter of Catherine. And so he goes downstairs, and the people working in the house are like just starting the fire. They're getting everything ready. Dr. Lockwood or Mr. Lockwood decides not to stay for breakfast because everything is uncomfortable and weird and awkward. And so as soon as the light starts, he is leaving. And Heathcliff decides that he is going to walk with him, and it's a good thing that he did because everything is covered in snow, and so like meandering around like ditches and gorges and whatever else kind of holes are out there. And so he finally makes it, and the people in his home were so worried about him, they thought that he died in the middle of the night because no word had been sent over, and that's where the chapter ended. What an uncomfortable stay. Just deeply uncomfortable. All right. Chapter 4. What vain weathercocks we are. There is immediately a note. Variable, inconstant creatures. I, who had determined to hold myself independent of all social intercourse, and thanked my stars that, at length, I had lighted on a spot where it was next to impracticable. I, weak wretch, after maintaining till dusk a struggle with low spirits and solitude, was finally compelled to strike my colors, and under pretence of gaining information concerning the necessities of my establishment, I desired Mrs. Dean, when she brought in supper, to sit down while I ate, hoping sincerely she would prove a regular gossip, and either rouse me to animation or lull me to sleep by her talk. "You have lived here a considerable time," I commenced. "Did you not say 16 years?" "18, sir. I came when the mistress was married, to wait on her. After she died, the master retained me for this housekeeper." "Indeed." There ensued a pause. She was not a gossip, I feared, unless about her own affairs, and those could hardly interest me. However, having studied for an interval with a fist on either knee and a cloud of meditation over her ruddy countenance, she exclaimed, "Ah, times are greatly changed since then." "Yes," I remarked, "you've seen a good many alterations, I suppose." "Oh, I have, and troubles, too," she says. "Oh, I'll turn the talk to my landlord's family," I thought to myself. A good subject to start. And that pretty widow, I should like to know her history, whether she be a native of the country, or, as is more probable, an exotic, that the surly indignants would not recognize for kin. With this intention, I asked Mrs. Dean why Heathcliff let Thrushcross Grange, and preferred living in a situation and residence so much inferior. Is he not rich enough to keep the estate in good order? I required. Rich, sir, she returned. He has he has nobody knows about money, and every year it increases. Yes, yes, he's rich enough to live a finer house than this, but he's very near, close-handed, and if he had meant to flit to Thrushcross Grange as soon as he heard of a good tenant, he could not have borne to miss the chance of getting a few hundred more. It is strange people should be so greedy when they are alone in the world. There is a note after flit, and it just means to move or to transfer. He had a son, it seems. Yes, he had one. He is dead. And that young lady, Mrs. Heathcliff, is his widow? Yes. Where did she come from, originally? Why, sir, she is my late master's daughter. Catherine Linton was her maiden name. I nursed her, poor thing. I did wish Mr. Heathcliff would remove here, and there we might have been together. What? Catherine Linton? I exclaimed, astonished. But a minute's reflection convinced me it was not my ghostly Catherine. Then, I continued, my predecessor's name was Linton? Oh, it was. And who is that Earnshaw? Hareton Earnshaw, who lives with Mr. Heathcliff. Are they relations? Oh, no, he is the late Mrs. Linton's nephew. The young lady's cousin, then? Yes, and her husband was her cousin also, one on the mother's side and the other on the father's side. Heathcliff married Mr. Linton's sister. Oh, I see the house at Wuthering Heights has Earnshaw carved over the front door. Are they an old family? Oh, very old, sir, and Hareton is the last of them, as Miss Cathy is of us. I mean of the Lintons. Have you been to Wuthering Heights? I beg pardon for asking, but I should like to hear how she is. Mrs. Heathcliff. She looked very well and very handsome, yet I think not very happy. Oh dear, I don't wonder. And how did you like the master? A rough fellow, rather, Mrs. Dean. Is not that his character? Rough as a saw-edge, and hard as whinstone. A very hard rock, such as basalt. The less you meddle with him, the better. He must have some ups and downs in life to make him such a churl. Do you know anything of his history? Oh, he's a cuckoo, sir. A hedge or sparrow. I know all about it, except where he was born, and who were his parents, and how he got his money at first, and Hareton had been cast out like an unfledged duncock. That means a shelf at the back of a fireplace where food is kept warm. The unfortunate lad is the only one in all this parish that does not guess how he has been cheated. Well, Mrs. Dean, it will be a charitable deed to tell me something of my neighbors. I feel I shall not rest if I go to bed, so be good enough to sit and chat an hour. Oh, certainly, sir. I'll just fetch a little sewing, and then I'll sit as long as you please. But you've caught cold. I saw you're shivering, and you must have some gruel to drive it out. The worthy woman bustled off, and I crouched nearer the fire. My head felt hot, and the rest of me chill. Moreover, I was excited, almost to a pitch of foolishness, though my nerves and brain. This caused me to feel not uncomfortable, but rather fearful, as I am still, of serious effects from the incidents of today and yesterday. She returned presently, bringing a smoking basin and a basket of work, and having placed the former on the hob, drew in her seat, evidently pleased to find me so companionable. Oh my gosh, hold up. Wait a minute. I have mixed up the footnotes. The hob is the shelf on the back of a fireplace. Not that. And the duncock is the hedge or sparrow. I am a silly goose, you know. Before I came to live here, she commenced, waiting no further invitation to her story,
I was almost always at Wuthering Heights, because my mother had nursed Mr Hindley Earnshaw, that was Hareton's father, and I got used to playing with the children. I ran errands too, and helped to make hay, and hung about the farm ready for anything that anybody would set me to. One fine summer morning, it was the beginning of harvest, I remember, Mr Earnshaw, the old master, came downstairs, dressed for a journey, and, after he had told Joseph what was to be done during the day, he turned to Hindley and Cathy and me, for I sat eating my porridge with them, and he said, speaking to his son, "Now, my bonny man, I'm going to Liverpool to-day. What shall I bring you? You may choose what you like, only let it be little, for I shall walk there and back 60 miles each way." That is a long spell, Hindley. Hindley named a fiddle, and then I asked Miss Cathy, and then he asked Miss Cathy. She was hardly 6 years old, but she could ride any horse in the stable, and she chose a whip. He did not forget me, for he had a kind heart.
It seemed a long while to us all, the 3 days of his absence, and often did little Cathy ask when he would be home. Mrs. Earnshaw expected him by supper time on the third evening, and she put the meal off hour after hour. There were no signs of his coming, however, and at last the 3 children got tired of running down to the gate to look. Then it grew dark. She would have had them to bed, but they begged sadly to be allowed to stay up, and, just about 11 o'clock, the door-latch was raised quietly, and in stepped the master. He threw himself into a chair, laughing and groaning, and bid them all stand off, for he was nearly killed. He would not have such another walk for the 3 kingdoms, England, Ireland, and Scotland. At the end of it to be flighted to death. Flighted, put to flight, frightened, he said, opening his great coat, which he held bundled up in his arms. "See here, wife, I was never so beaten with anything in my life, but you must e'en take it as a gift of God, though it's a dark, almost as if it came from the devil." We crowded round, and over Miss Cathy's head I had a peep as a dirty, ragged, black-haired child, big enough both to walk and talk. Indeed, its face looked older than Catherine's, yet when it was set on its feet, it only stared round, and repeated over and over some gibberish that nobody could understand. I was frightened, and Mrs. Earnshaw was ready to fling it out of doors. She did fly up, asking how he could fashion to bring that gipsy brat into the home when they had their own bairns to feed and fend for. Bairns being children. What he meant to do with it, and whether he were mad. The master tried to explain the matter, but he was really half dead with fatigue, and all that I could make out, amongst her scolding, was a tale of his seeing it starving and houseless, and as good as dumb in the streets of Liverpool, where he picked it up and inquired for its owner. Not a soul knew to whom it belonged, he said, and his money and time being both limited, he thought it better to take home with him at once, than run into vain expenses there, because he was determined he would not leave it as he found it. Well, the conclusion was, that my mistress grumbled herself calm, and Mr. Earnshaw told me to wash it, and give it clean things, and let it sleep with the children. Hindley and Cathy contented themselves with looking and listening till peace was restored. Then both began searching their father's pockets for the presents he had promised them. The former was a boy of 14, but when he drew out what had been a fiddle crushed to morsels in the great-coat, he blubbered aloud, and Cathy, when she learned the master had lost her whip in attending on the stranger, showed her humour by grinning and spitting at the stupid little thing, earning for her pains a sound blow from her father to teach her clearer manners. They entirely refused to have it in bed with them, or even in their room, and I had no more sense, so I put it on the landing of the stairs, hoping it might be gone on the morrow. By chance, or else attracted by hearing his voice, it crept into Mr. Earnshaw's door, and there he found it on quitting his chamber. Inquiries were made as to how it got there. I was obliged to confess, and in recompense for my cowardice and inhumanity was sent out of the door. This was Heathcliff's first introduction to the family. On coming back a few days afterwards, for I did not consider my banishment perpetual, I found they had christened him Heathcliff. It was the name of a son who died in childhood, and it was served him ever since, both for Christian and surname. Miss Cathy and he were now very thick, but Hindley hated him, and to say the truth, I did the same, and we plagued and went on with him shamefully. For I wasn't reasonable enough to feel my injustice, and the mistress never put in a word on his behalf when she saw him wronged. He seemed a sullen, patient child, hardened, perhaps, to ill treatment. He would stand Hindley's blows without winking or shedding a tear, and my pinches moved him only to draw in a breath and open his eyes, as if he had hurt himself by accident, and nobody was to blame. This endurance made old Earnshaw furious when he discovered his son persecuting the poor, fatherless child, as he had called him. He took to Heathcliff strangely, believing all he said. For that matter, he said precious little, and generally the truth, and petting him up far above Cathy, who was too mischievous and wayward for a favourite. So, from the very beginning, he bred bad feeling in the house, and at Mrs. Earnshaw's death, which happened in less than 2 years after, the young master had learned to regard his father as an oppressor rather than a friend, and Heathcliff as a usurper of his parents' affections and his privileges, and he grew bitter with brooding over these injuries. I sympathized a while, but when the child fell ill of the measles, and I had to tend to them and take on me the cares of a woman at once, I changed my idea. Heathcliff was dangerously sick, and while he lay at the worst he would have me constantly at his pillow. I suppose he felt I did a good deal for him, and he hadn't wit to guess that I was compelled to do it. However, I will say this, he was the quietest child that ever nurse watched over. The difference between him and the others forced me to be less forced me to be less partial. Cathy and her brother harassed me terribly. He was as uncomplaining as a lamb, though hardness, not gentleness, made him give little trouble. He got through, and the doctor affirmed it was a great measure owing to me, and praised me for my care. I was vain of his commendations, and softened towards the being by whose means I earned them, and thus Hindley lost his last ally. Still, I couldn't dote on Heathcliff, and I wondered often what my master saw to admire so much in the sullen boy, who, never to my recollection, repaid his indulgence of any sign of gratitude. He was not insolent to his benefactor. He was simply insensible, though knowing perfectly the hold he had on his heart, and conscious he had only to speak, and all the house would be obliged to bend to his wishes. As an instance, I remember Mr. Earnshaw once bought a couple of colts at the parish fair, and gave the lads each one. Heathcliff took the handsomest, but it soon fell, and when he discovered it, he said to Hindley, "You must exchange horses with me. I don't like mine, and if you won't, I shall tell your father of the 3 thrashings you've given me this week, and show him my arm, which is black to the shoulder." Hindley put out his tongue and cuffed him over the ears. "You'd better do it at once," he persisted, escaping to the porch. They were in the stable. "You will have to. If I speak of these blows, you'll get them again, with interest." "Off, dog," cried Hindley, threatening him with an iron weight used for weighing potatoes and hay. "Throw it," he replied, standing still, "and then I'll tell you I'll tell how you boasted that you would turn me out of doors as soon as he died, and see whether he will not turn you out directly." Hindley threw it, hitting him on the chest, and down he fell. He staggered up immediately, breathless and white, and had not I prevented it, he would have gone just so to the master, and full of revenge by letting his condition plead for him, intimating who had caused it. "Take my colt, gypsy, then," said young Earnshaw, "and I pray that he may break your neck. Take him, and be damned, you interloper, and wheedle my father out of all he has, only afterwards show him what you are, imp of Satan. And take that, I hope he'll kick out your brains." Heathcliff had gone to loose the beast and shift it to his own stall. He was passing behind it when Hindley finished his speech of knocking him under his feet, and without stooping to examine whether his hopes were fulfilled, ran away as fast as he could. I was surprised to witness how coolly the child gathered himself up, and went on with his intention, exchanging saddles and all, and then sitting down on a bundle of hay to overcome the qualm which the violent blow occasioned. Before he entered the house, I persuaded him easily to let me lay the blame of his bruises on the horse. He minded little what tale was told, since he had what he wanted. He complained so seldom, indeed, of which stirs as these, that I really thought him not vindictive. I was deceived completely, as you will hear. End of chapter 4. Okay, so this chapter starts with Mr. Lockwood being served coffee and like a little bit of what? Oats? Gruel? Oatmeal? I don't know. Being served something by the housekeeper. What is her darling name? What is your name, friend? Nobody knows. Oh my gosh, say your name. Say my name, say my name. No one is around you. Say, baby, I love you. Linton. Mrs. Linton, but I don't know what her first name is. Can't find it. Linton. Mrs. Linton, the housekeeper. And so he is trying to get information from her. It's like, maybe she's a gossip and will just like blabber about everything that's going on with Heathcliff, the house, everything that's happening, because things are weird. And so he tries to test a little bit to see. And yes, she is. She is a bit of a gossip. And so we go back to forever ago when she's young and she is taking care of the Earnshaw family, who owns Wuthering Heights at the time, and the Mr. Earnshaw is about to go out for a 3-day venture. He is walking real far, and before he leaves, he asks both of his children what they would like. And so he leaves. On the 3rd day, he returns, and he does return with what they asked for, a violin and a whip for the horse. But he lost the whip for the horse, and the violin is broken. But he returns with a child who he found on the street that was starving, didn't have any parents, and so he felt so terribly that he just like scooped him up and decided to adopt him, I guess. And so now this boy is living here, and this boy is Heathcliff. And Heathcliff is a very quiet child. The other 2 children don't like him at all because he has started to sort of take over all of the affection of their parents. And of course, they don't like that. And so they're kind of terrible to him. They're like physically abusive to him, and then also just like calling him names and everything, and just being terrible. And Mrs. Linton, as she's explaining this story, is like, well, like I always thought that he was a quiet kid, and that, he was not vindictive and blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, she's like, but I was wrong, and you will soon see why. Bum, bum, bum. All right, let us take a little gander, shall we? Oh, yeah. The next chapter. I was like, let's see how long the next chapter is. The next chapter is like 3 pages. We definitely have time for that. Cool, 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 cool. Okay. Yeah, let's do it. Chapter 5. In the course of time, Mr. Earnshaw began to fail. He had been active and healthy, yet his strength left him suddenly, and when he was confined to the chimney corner, he grew grievously irritable. A nothing vexed him, and suspected slights of his authority nearly threw him into fits. This was especially to be remarked if anyone attempted to impose upon, or domineer over, his favorite. He was painfully jealous lest a word should be spoken amiss to him, seeming to have got into his head the notion that, because he liked Heathcliff, all hated and longed to do him an ill turn. It was a disadvantage to the lad, for the kinder among us did not wish to fret the master, so we humoured his partiality, and that humouring was rich nourishment to the child's pride and black tempers. Still, it became in a manner necessary, twice or thrice. Hindley's manifestation of scorn, while his father was near, roused the old man to a fury. He seized his stick to strike him, and shook with rage that he could not do it. As our last curate, suffice. We had a curate then who made the living answer. At our last curate, we had a curate then who made the last living answer, suffice, by teaching the little Lintons and Earnshaws and farming this bit of land himself. Advised that the young man should be sent to college, and Mr. Earnshaw agreed, though with a heavy spirit, for he had said Hindley was not and would not thrive as where he wanted. As where he wandered. I hope heartily we should have peace now. It hurt me to think the master should be made uncomfortable by his own good deed. I fancied the discontent of age and disease arose from his family disagreements, as he would have it that it did. Really, you know, sir, it was in this sinking frame. We might have got on tolerably, notwithstanding, but for 2 people, Miss Cathy and Joseph, the servant. You saw him, I dare say, up yonder. He was, and is yet most likely, the wearisomest, self-righteous Pharisee that ever ransacked a Bible to rake the promises to himself and fling the curses to his neighbor. Pharisee, hypocrite, is what the note says that they're aiming for. By his knack of sermonizing and pious discoursing, he contrived to make a great impression on Mr. Earnshaw, and the more feeble the master became, the more influence he gained. He was relentless in worrying him about his soul's concerns, and about ruling his children rigidly. He encouraged him to regard Hindley as a reprobate, and, night after night, he regularly grumbled out a long string of tales against Heathcliff and Catherine, always minding to flatter Earnshaw's weakness by heaping the heaviest blame on the latter. Certainly she had ways with her such as I never saw a child take up before, and she put all of us past our patience 50 times, and oftener in a day. From the hour she came downstairs till the hour she went to bed, we had not a minute's security that she wouldn't be in mischief. Her spirits were always at high water mark, her tongue always going, singing, laughing, and plaguing everybody who would not do the same. A wild, wicked slip she was. Charlotte Bronte altered the original Wick meaning lively or mischievous, to wicked. But she had the bonniest eyes, the sweetest smile, the lightest foot in the parish, and, after all, I believe she meant no harm. For when once she made you cry in good earnest, it seldom happened that she would not keep you company, and oblige you to be quiet, that you might comfort her. She was much too fond of Heathcliff. The greatest punishment we could invent for her was to keep her separate from him. Yet she got chided more than any of us on his account. In play, she liked exceedingly to act the little mistress, using her hands freely and commanding her companions. She did so to me, but I would not bear slapping and ordering, and so I let her know. Now, Mr. Earnshaw did not understand jokes from his children. He had always been strict and grave with them, and Catherine, on her part, had no idea why her father should be crosser and less patient in his ailing condition than he was in his prime. His peevish reproofs wakened in her a naughty delight to provoke him. She was never so happy as when we were all scolding her at once, and she defying us with her bold, saucy look, and her ready words, turning Joseph's religious curses into ridicule, baiting me, and doing just what her father hated most, showing how her pretended insolence, which he thought real, had more power over Heathcliff than his kindness, how the boy would do her bidding in anything, and his only when it suited his own inclination. After behaving as badly as possible all day, she sometimes came fondling to make it up at night. "Nay, Cathy," the old man would say, "I cannot love thee. Thou art worse than thy brother. Go say thy prayers, child, and ask God's pardon. I doubt thy mother and I must rue that we ever reared thee." That made her cry, at first, and then being repulsed continually hardened her, and she laughed if I told her to say she was sorry for her faults and begged to be forgiven. But the hour came, at last, that ended Mr. Earnshaw's troubles on earth. He died quietly in his chair one October evening, seated by the fireside. A high wind blustered round the house and roared in the chimney. It sounded wild and stormy, yet it was not cold, and we were all together. I, a little removed from the hearth, busy at my knitting, and Joseph reading his Bible near the table, for the servants generally sat in the house then, after their work was done. Miss Cathy had been sick, and that made her still. She leant against her father's knee, and Heathcliff was lying on the floor with his head in her lap. I remember the master, before he fell into a doze, stroking her bonny hair. It pleased him rarely to see her gentle. It pleased him exceedingly. And saying, "Why canst thou not always be a good lass, Cathy?" And she turned her face up to his and laughed, and answered, "Why cannot you always be a good man, father?" But as soon as she saw him vexed again, she kissed his hand and said she would sing him to sleep. She began singing very low till his fingers dropped from hers, and his head sank on his breast. Then I told her to hush and not stir, for fear she should wake him. We all kept as mute as mice a full half-hour, and should have done longer, only Joseph, having finished his chapter, got up and said that he must rouse the master for prayers and bed. He stepped forward and called him by name and touched his shoulder, but he would not move. So he took the candle and looked at him. I thought there was something wrong as he set down the light, and seizing the children each by an arm, whispered them to frame upstairs and take their little din. They might pray alone that evening. He had somewhat to do. Okay, frame upstairs, go upstairs, had somewhat to do. Something to do. "I shall bid father good night first," said Catherine, putting her arm round his neck. Before we could hinder her, the poor thing discovered her loss directly. she screamed out. "Oh, he's dead! Heathcliff, he's dead!" And they both set up a heart-breaking cry. I joined my wail to theirs, loud and bitter, but Joseph asked what we could be thinking of to roar in that way over a saint in heaven. He told me to put on my cloak and run to Gimmerton for the doctor and the parson. I could not guess the use that either would be of then. However, I went, through wind and rain, and brought one, the doctor, back with me. The other said he would come in the morning. Leaving Joseph to explain matters, I ran to the children's room. Their door was ajar. I saw they had never lain down, though it was past midnight. But they were calmer, and did not need me to console them. The little souls were comforting each other with better thoughts than I could have hit on. No person in the world ever pictured heaven so beautifully as they did, in their innocent talk, and while I sobbed and listened, I could not help wishing we were all safe together. End of chapter 5. Okay, so very short, but Linton is continuing to explain, like, talk about early in the Earnshaws, and just saying that Earnshaw highly favored Heathcliff, and everybody knew it. And nobody really dissuaded it, and because of it, Catherine sort of rebelled more and more just to get attention, and she like soaked in all of the attention and just like reveled in it and just loved when everybody was mad at her, it seemed like, just so that like she was getting attention, people were paying attention to her type of a thing. And yeah, and it's so wild. So he's getting sick, and Kathy is just like not understanding why he can't be nicer and why he has such a sharp uh consonance any time and short temper and all of these things like when he's feeling sick. And he says to her like, "Why can't you be a good lass all the time, Kathy?" And then her reply is, "Why can't you always be a good man?" And then he dies. Well, she sings him to sleep, but he really dies. And wow. Wow, wow, wow. Like in front of everybody. But like people think that he's just sleeping, but Joseph knows that he died and was like, "Ah, the children need to go to bed." But Catherine is like, "Oh, I need to hug my papa," and goes over there and realizes that he's dead and starts screaming, and then everybody's sad and starts crying. Okay. Let's do one more chapter. Let's do. Let's do. Let's do it. Let's do it. Chapter 6. Uh, Mr. Hindley came home to the funeral, and, a thing that amazed us and set the neighbors gossiping right and left, he brought his wife with him. What she was and where she was born he never informed us. Probably she had neither money nor name to recommend her, or he would scarcely have kept the union from his father. She was not one that would have disturbed the house much on her own account. Every object she saw, the moment she crossed the threshold, appeared to delight her, and every circumstance that took place about her, except the preparing for the burial and the presence of the mourners. I thought she was half silly from her behavior while that went on. She ran into her chamber and made me come with her, though I should have been dressing the children, and there she sat, shivering and clasping her hands and asking repeatedly, "Are they gone yet?" Then she began describing with hysterical emotion the effect it produced on her to see black, and started and trembled and at last fell a-weeping. There we go. And when I asked what was the matter, answered, she didn't know. But she felt so afraid of dying. I imagined her a little likely to die as myself. She was rather thin, but young and fresh complexioned, and her eyes sparkled as bright as diamonds. I did remark, to be sure, that mounting the stairs made her breathe very quick, and the least sudden noise set her all in a quiver, and that she coughed troublesomely sometimes. but I knew nothing of what these symptoms portended, and had no impulse to sympathize with her. We don't in general take foreigners, strangers, here, Mr. Lockwood, unless they take to us first. That's a note here. Foreigners has an asterisk, and it means strangers. Young Earnshaw was altered considerably in the 3 years of his absence. He had grown sparer and lost his color, and spoke and dressed quite differently. And on the very day of his return he told Joseph and me we must thenceforth quarter ourselves in the back kitchen, and leave the house for him. Indeed, he would have carpeted and papered a small spare room for a parlor, but his wife expressed such pleasure at the white floor and huge glowing fireplace, at the pewter dishes and delf case, which there's a note which is cupboard for holding blue and white glazed earthenware, or delftware, and dog kennel, and the wide space there was to move about in, where they usually sat, that he thought it unnecessary to her comfort, and so dropped the intention. She expressed pleasure, too, at finding a sister among her new acquaintance, and she prattled to Catherine, and kissed her, and ran about with her, and gave her quantities of presents at the beginning. Her affection tired very soon, however, and when she grew peevish, Hindley became tyrannical. A few words from her, evincing a dislike to Heathcliff, were enough to rouse in him all his old hatred of the boy. He drove him from their company to the servants, deprived him of the instructions of the curate, and insisted that he should labor out of doors instead, compelling him to do so as hard as any other lad on the farm. Heathcliff bore his degradation pretty well at first, because Cathy taught him what she learnt, and worked or played with him in the fields. They both promised fair to grow up as rude as savages, the young master being entirely negligent how they behaved and what they did, so they kept clear of him. He would not even have seen after their going to church on Sundays, only Joseph and the curate reprimanded his carelessness when they absented themselves, and that reminded him to order Heathcliff a flogging, and Catherine a fast from dinner or supper. But it was one of their chief amusements to run away to the moors in the morning and remain there all day, and the after-punishment grew a mere thing to laugh at. The curate might set as many chapters as he pleased for Catherine to get by heart, and Joseph might thrash Heathcliff till his arm ached. They forgot everything the minute they were together again. At least the minute they had contrived some naughty plan of revenge. And many a time I've cried to myself to watch them growing more reckless daily, and I not daring to speak a syllable for fear of losing the small power I still retained over the unfriended creatures. One Sunday evening it chanced that they were banished from the sitting-room for making a noise, or a light offence of the kind, and when I went to call them to supper, I could discover them nowhere. We searched the house above and below, and the yard and stables. They were invisible, and at last Hindley in a passion told us to bolt the doors, and swore nobody should let them in that night. The household went to bed, and I, too anxious to lie down, opened my lattice and put my head out to hearken, though it rained, determined to admit them in spite of the prohibition, should they return. In a while I distinguished steps coming up the road, and the light of a lantern glimmered through the gate. I threw a shawl over my head and ran to prevent them from waking Mr. Earnshaw by knocking. There was Heathcliff, by himself. It gave me a start to see him alone. "Where's Miss Catherine?" I asked hurriedly. "No accident, I hope?" "At Thrushcross Grange," he answered. "And I would have been there too, but they had not the manners to ask me to stay." "Well, you will catch it," I said. You'll never be content till you're sent about your business. What in the world led you wandering to Thrushcross Grange?" "Let me get off my wet clothes, and I'll tell you all about it, Nelly," he replied. I bid him beware of rousing the master, and while he undressed and waited to put out the candle, he continued. "Cathy and I escaped from the wash-house to have a ramble at liberty, and getting a glimpse of the Grange lights, we thought we would just go and see whether the Lintons passed their Sunday evenings standing shivering in corners, while their father and mother sat eating and drinking and singing and laughing and burning their eyes out before the fire. Do you think they do? Or reading sermons and being chastised by their manservant and set to learn a column of scripture names if they don't answer properly? Probably not, I responded. They are good children, no doubt, and don't deserve the treatment you receive for your bad conduct. Don't can't, Nellie, he said. Can't, meaning preach. Don't preach, Nellie, he said. Nonsense. We ran from the top of the heights to the park without stopping. Catherine completely beaten in the race because she was barefoot. You'll have to seek for her shoes in the bog tomorrow. We crept through a broken bridge, groped our way up the path, and planted ourselves on a flower plot under the drawing-room window. The light came from thence. They had not put up the shutters, and the curtains were only half closed. Both of us were able to look in by standing on the basement, and clinging to the ledge, and saw... It was a splendid place carpeted with crimson and crimson-colored chairs and tables and a pure white ceiling bordered by gold and a shower of glass drops hanging in silver chains from the center and shimmering with little soft tapers. Old Mr. and Mrs. Linton were not there. Edgar and his sister had it entirely to themselves. Shouldn't they have been happy? We should have thought ourselves in heaven. And now, guess what your good children were doing. Isabella, I believe she is 11, a year younger than Kathy, lay screaming at the farther end of the room, shrieking as if witches were running red-hot needles into her. Edgar stood on the hearth, weeping silently, and in the middle of the table sat a little dog, shaking its paw and yelping, which, from their mutual accusations, we understood they had nearly pulled in two between them. The idiots! And that was their pleasure, to quarrel who should hold a heap of warm hair, and each began to cry because both, after struggling to get it, refused to take it. We laughed outright at the petted thing. We did despise them. When would you catch me wishing to have what Catherine wanted, or find us by ourselves seeking entertainment in yelling and sobbing and rolling on the ground, divided by the whole room? I'd not exchange for 1,000 lives my condition here for Edgar Linton's at Thrushcross Grange. Not if I might have the privilege of flinging Joseph off the highest gable and painting the house front with Hindley's blood. Hush, hush, I interrupted. Still, you have not told me, Heathcliff, how Catherine is left behind. I told you we laughed, he answered. The Lintons heard us, and with one accord they shot like arrows to the door. There was silence, and then a cry. Oh, mamma, mamma, oh, papa, oh, mamma, come here, oh, papa, oh. They really did howl out something in that way. We made frightful noises to terrify them still more, and then we dropped off the ledge, because somebody was drawing the bars, and we felt we had better flee. I had Kathy by the hand and was urging her on, when all of a sudden she fell down. Run, Heathcliff, run, she whispered. They have let the bulldog loose, and he holds me. The devil had seized her ankle, Nellie. I heard his abominable snorting. She did not yell out. No, she would have scorned to do it, if she had been spitted on the horns of a mad cow. I did, though. I vociferated curses enough to annihilate any fiend in Christendom, and I got a stone and thrust it between his jaws, and tried with all my might to cram it down his throat. A beast of a servant came up with a lantern at last, shouting, "Keep fast, Skulker, keep fast." He changed his note, however, when he saw Skulker's game. The dog throttled off, his huge purple tongue hanging half a foot out of his mouth, and his pendant lips screaming with bloody slaver. The man took Kathy up. She was sick, not from fear, I'm certain, but from pain. He carried her in. I followed, grumbling, execrations, and vengeance. What pray, Robert? Hallowed Linton from the entrance. Skulker was caught a little girl, sir, he replied. And there's a lad, he added, making a clutch at me, who looks like an out-and-outer. Scoundrel. Who looks like a scoundrel. Very like the robbers were for putting them through the window to open the doors to the gang after all were asleep, that they might murder us at their ease. Hold your tongue, you foul-mouthed thief, you. You shall go to the gallows for this, Mr. Linton, sir. Don't lay by your gun. No, no, Robert, said the old fool. The rascals knew that yesterday was my rent day. They thought to have me cleverly. Come in, I'll furnish them a reception. There, John, fasten the chain. Give Skulker some water, Jenny. To Beard, a magistrate, in his stronghold, and on the Sabbath, too. To Beard, to affront or to defy. Where will their insolence stop? Oh, my dear Mary, look here. Don't be afraid. It is but a boy. Yet the villain scowls so plainly in his face. Would it not be a kindness to the country to hang him at once, before he shows his nature in acts as well as features? He pulled me under the chandelier, and Mrs. Linton placed her spectacles on her nose and raised her hands in horror. The cowardly children crept nearer also, Isabella lisping, "Frightful thing! Put him in the cellar, papa. He's exactly like the son of the fortune-teller that stole my tame pheasant, isn't he, Edgar?" While they examined me, Cathy came round. She heard the last speech and laughed. Edgar Linton, after an inquisitive stare, collected sufficient wit to recognize her. They see us at church, you know, though we seldom meet them elsewhere. "That's Miss Earnshaw," he whispered to his mother, "and look how Skulker has bitten her, how her foot bleeds." "Miss Earnshaw? Nonsense," said the dame. "Miss Earnshaw scouring the country with that boy? And yet, my dear, the child is in mourning. Surely it is, and she may be lamed for life." "What culpable carelessness is in her brother!" exclaimed Mr. Linton, turning from me to Catherine. "I've understood from Shielders," that was the curate, sir, "that he lets her grow up in absolute heathenism. But who is this? Where did she pick up this companion? Oh, I declare he is that strange acquisition my late neighbour made in his journey to Liverpool." "A wicked boy, at all events," remarked the old lady, "and quite unfit for a decent house. Did you notice his language, Linton? I'm shocked that my children should have heard it." I recommenced cursing. Don't be angry, Nelly. And so Robert was ordered to take me off. I refused to go without Cathy. He dragged me into the garden, pushed the lantern into my hand, assured me that Mr. Earnshaw should be informed of my behaviour, and, bidding me march directly, secured the door again. The curtains were still looped up at one corner, and I resumed my station as spy, because if Catherine had wished to return, I intended shattering their great glass panes into a million of fragments unless they let her out. She sat on a sofa quietly. Mrs. Linton took off the grey cloak of the dairymaid, which she had borrowed for our excursion, shaking her head and expostulating with her, I suppose. She was a young lady, and they made a distinction between her treatment and mine. Then the woman-servant brought a basin of warm water and washed her feet, and Mr. Linton mixed a tumbler of sherry or port, and Isabella emptied a plateful of cakes into her lap, and Edgar stood gaping at a distance. Afterwards they dried and combed her beautiful hair, and gave her a pair of enormous slippers, and wheeled her to the fire, and I left her, as merry as she could be, dividing her food between the little dog and Skulker, whose nose she pinched as he ate, and kindling a spark of spirit in the vacant blue eyes of the Lintons, a dim reflection from her own enchanting face. I saw they were full of stupid admiration. She is so immeasurably superior to them, to everybody on earth. Is she not, Nelly? "There will be more come of this business than you reckon on," I answered, covering him up and extinguishing the light. "You are incurable, Heathcliff, and Mr. Hindley will have to procure to extremities. See if he won't." My words came truer than I desired. The luckless adventure made Earnshaw furious. And then Mr. Linton, to mend matters, paid us a visit himself on the morrow, and read the young master such a lecture on the road he guided his family, that he was stirred to look about him in earnest. Heathcliff received no flogging, but he was told that the first word he spoke to Miss Catherine should ensure a dismissal, and Mrs. Earnshaw undertook to keep her sister-in-law in due restraint when she returned home. employing art, not force. With force, she would have found it impossible. End of chapter 6. Okay, so Kathy / Catherine and Heathcliff are becoming closer. They're finding a kinship and they're enjoying each other's company. And with that, they're also getting in trouble together. And so they're getting in trouble, and their manservant is punishing them. And so they run away. And so manservant is like, lock the doors, don't let them in. They're in trouble. They need to learn a lesson. And us, being Nellie Linton, it was like, no, I'm gonna let them in if I see them because it's raining and cold and they're gonna get sick, blah blah blah. And so she does see something outside. She runs outside and it is just Heathcliff by himself. And so she asks what happened to Catherine, and he tells the story of them running over to Thrushcross. I can't say the name because it's difficult. But they run over to the other space still on the property, and they're like, you think that these two little kids are, the most perfect angel? Well, they're not. What we saw was them, the aftermath of them fighting over a dog, like trying to play tug of war with the dog to see who would hold on to the dog, because they wanted to, they each wanted the dog for themselves, and so they were pulling on the dog, and ultimately everybody was upset. The dog was hurt, the child was screaming, and the other kid was sobbing. So they're outside watching this, and they start laughing, and they get caught. And Kathy is running and trips, and the dog that they set out has bitten her foot, and so she can't walk. She's bleeding everywhere. And they bring her inside, and they're like, this is, this is Kathy. I don't think they say her name, but they say who she is, that she's the Earnshaw kid. And this other kid who is repulsive, disgusting, obviously the reason why Kathy is in trouble. And I think he's that boy that the late neighbor acquired. So they have heard that he picked him up, that that Earnshaw picked him up when on his travels. And yeah, wild. And I think that's where we left. Well, and Heathcliff is saying all these threats that he's gonna break everything down and blah blah blah, and that Kathy is the best person ever and so much higher than what this family is, and they need to show respect and all that stuff. So getting a good picture of the relationship between, or at least the beginning relationship between, Catherine and Heathcliff, and also how they are viewed on an outside perspective. So that's cool. That's it tonight. I apparently did read this in 2014. I don't remember anything. This is all completely new to me. So that's cool. Love reading books that seem like they're new. But I'm enjoying it so far. I'm liking it. We'll see, we'll see. And I do know that this isn't a spoiler, but I do know that Heathcliff and Catherine are just monstrous people, and you're not supposed to like them. So that's cool. That's cool. But yeah, that's it for tonight. I hope you all have a great evening. I hope you have a great everything. Actually, if I don't, we'll pick up right where we left off next week. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. Goodbye.